when it's moving, I hope, in the right direction.
No, an impressive backdrop, I must say. Cool. Well, thank you. I'm recording, but we're not necessarily starting yet. I just wanted to say hello.
That's fine, Paul, though, whatever.
Are you well?
I'm very well, thank God. In this,
Yeah,
we've gone through both the medical and the political plague.
Exactly. I was just looking at your photographs, if I may say. I mean, someone was saying how elegant and agile you look in the photographs you sent me, and I thought, what those are two precisely the right words: elegant and agile.
Thank you. I love the one from the last time we were able to get into Damascus was in 2010. We had the brilliant idea that we come back in 2011 and bring 40 people to see what Paul's Damascus was like. And about 1 month before we were due to leave, that would have been 2011, and we were supposed to go May the 1st. April the 1st, we suddenly realized, with everything paid, I mean, we were doing with the company, so it wasn't our money, that we were heading into a civil war. So we had to call everything off. So I love the pictures that we still have from that time. Palmyra, for example.
You mentioned, I mean, I won't go into it now, perhaps, but Father Paolo in your new book about his execution. But I was just reading this nice book about Resurrection Son, and suddenly this extraordinary story about a Jesuit. You know, it's just an awful story. It's suddenly reality hits you hard.
Yeah, and it's sad because Syria had gone way out of its way, actually. I mean, the place, his monastery, could not have been built just privately. I mean, it was the support road and everything into it. So it was the terrible irony of Syria, of course, is that since he himself was such a minor group, he was supported Christians. Christians got much more support.
Yeah, exactly.
So they were unfortunately on the wrong side a lot of times. And that the monastery, if you looked it up, Mar Musa, if you look it up on the web, it's, you know, it's like a swallow's nest hanging off a cliff or something. It was sad. We met him and we're all set to come back, and we'd be taking 40 people every year in search of Paul to Turkey. Yeah. As you know. And this was a brilliant idea. This one year we go Paul from Damascus to Ephesus. Would be lovely. A week in Damascus, a week in Ephesus as our base. And at the last minute we had to make a very swift change, Paul from Anatolia to the Aegean.
Very frightening, very frightening. I mean,
it was very sad, really.
Very, very frightening. I better start because it's too tempting just to get started. So I'll just, so my first question, if that's a good one to start with, is how an Irishman ends up in America. Can I start? Is that all right if I start with that? Or?
Are we live, by the way, or are you just recording for?
Oh yeah, sorry, I should have said. Well, I'm not brave enough to go live streaming yet, so I'm recording it. It'll go out later in a few hours. So I want it to be live ultimately, but I'm not brave yet. But I'll send you a copy, obviously, and that'll be great. So perhaps we'll, I guess we'll just start. So welcome, Dr. John Dominic Crossan to Blogging Theology. And as I said before we went live, that the globe behind you is rotating. So it's an extraordinary picture, giving you that kind of global status, which you have anyway. In a sense. So can I just ask, how does an Irishman, which you definitely sound like an Irishman, end up in the United States and forging such an amazing career there? Why there?
Okay, let me keep a long story short. Back in 1945, I was 11 and I was going to high school. We were living in the wilds of Donegal, now 1945, remember Donegal. And I had to go to a boarding school. Don't please think of the elite schools, the prep schools here, or your own private schools. This was an economic necessity. Small towns, villages, hamlets, crossroads in Donegal couldn't have their own high school. They had one central boarding school. If you were in that town, you were a day boy. So that's what it was. But the curriculum was magnificent because it had been left over by the receding tides of the British Empire. So I got 5 years. I got as good a course in the wilds of Donegal as I could have got, quite frankly, at Eton without the bullying. 5 years of Greek and 5 years of Latin, really? Which was very important for my whole future life, as it turned out. I mean, that it was just something I had to do, and we did it. And of course, but you know, reading reading Virgil by the time I was 12 or something like that.
Wow.
We didn't think anything of it. Honestly, I don't want to make it sound as, this was just one more chore you had to do. They made you do it. You took your exams, you passed your exams.
Yeah,
And we did it all in Gaelic.
Wow.
We were thinking in English because I wasn't a native speaker. Maybe half the students were native speakers. You were thinking in English, reading Latin or Greek, and then speaking English and trying to fool the teacher that really you knew the Greek and Latin, but you just couldn't get the Irish out. Because they couldn't blame you for not knowing the second. Anyway, so it was a magnificent education. Yeah. Now, I didn't appreciate it at the time, but one of the things we used to do there, we had 4 hours at night in a study hall. You had to be in there, you had to be doing what you're supposed to be doing.
Yeah.
The last hour, they allowed in what we call vocation directors. That would be very charismatic priests. Almost all of them were from the foreign missions. You know, our teachers were ordinary diocesan priests. They were good guys, great teachers. I was never interested in becoming a diocesan priest. I'd been with them since I was 8 as an altar boy, and they were not interesting. These guys were dynamic. They'd been in Africa, they'd been in Asia.
Yeah.
I thought at 15, honestly, I wasn't giving up my life for Christ. None of that stuff. This is the biggest adventure I can imagine at 15. It was an American. It was my first American I'd ever met. 19, that would be what, 49. If you join our order, it was an American province of a 13th century order. So basically Ireland was a recruiting station, plain language. As soon as you did your 1 year and took your vows, you were going to Louvain or to Rome or to America. I thought this was exciting.
Well, yeah.
It thrilled the daylights out of me. When I told my family, my father's response was, well, you spent since you were 11, you were running your own life in the boarding school. We trust you know what you're doing. And if it doesn't work out, this is always your home. They didn't push me, didn't pull me. They waved me goodbye. So on the Queen Mary, 1951, they told us that monastic life was out of this world and second class on the Queen Mary was out of this world. So I arrived in New York from Southampton.
You went on the Queen Mary on this great British steamer, whatever it was, all the way to New York. I mean, it's almost like a Hollywood film, isn't it? It's extraordinary.
I mean, it was unbelievable. You know, American money, of course, was very strong in those days, as you can imagine. And all my teachers there at the monastery were American. And they called up Cunard White Star. They said, you know, we have to get 3 students. There was 3 of us to America as fast as possible. What's the fastest thing you can give us? And they said, well, we've some second class and the Queen Mary is leaving. I mean, I don't know if they said first class, what would have happened?
Yeah, exactly.
So amazing. I arrived here on the Queen Mary, as I said, which was an adventure. I mean, it was more of the same. So then what happened after that, of course, was again, all of a sudden you have a student who has 5 years of Greek and 5 years of Latin every day, by the way. So it was good. And of course, that was not American. So all of a sudden I stood out in the class, not smarter than anyone else, but I just knew these languages and was quite at home with them. So they decided, well, instead of going off as a monastic priest to the missions in Africa, which is what thrilled me with the idea, you're going to become a professor.
Yes.
And that set my life. They made that decision. I loved it, of course. So that's how I ended up in America and as a professor.
That's an extraordinary story, very glamorous. But you're also perhaps, I don't know, to my mind, you've always been most associated with the Jesus Seminar, connected with them. Back in the 80s, you were a co-chair of that. Could you just tell our audience a little bit about the Jesus Seminar, which I think now is not quite dead, but it's moribund. Is that the right word?
That would be nice. It's encased in a nice coffin. Yeah. I think the important thing is this. In 69, I was a monastic priest, and I was invited on television to discuss papal encyclical Humanae Vitae, which was the disaster. A lot of them are, but this was a particular.
I read it. Yes, very controversial.
Yeah, exactly. On birth control, and the only thing approved was either continence or rhythm.
For the audience, the Humanae Vitae was a letter or an encyclical issued by the Pope at that time that prohibited or reaffirmed the traditional Catholic teaching that all artificial contraception was illicit, wrong, immoral, a sin, basically.
It's a moral sin,
and yet the church was expecting at that, well, many people in the church were expecting after Vatican II, this great new opening to the world, that perhaps that teaching might be changed or jettisoned. But actually that Pope reinforced it, and it's still the teaching today in 2021.
It hasn't changed. It was Paul VI, and I finished my doctorate in let me think, in 59, and went straight to Rome. So I was in Rome doing postdoctoral work on the Bible from 59 to 61. So when I came back to America after those 4 years gone, we were all certain, our generation, this is going to change. And maybe even married clergy and all sorts of changes. So it was a huge shock. Worse than simply, well, more of the same. So in 69, I was invited on television along with a medical doctor who said that rhythm works perfectly and all the rest of it. And I simply said that, well, you know, Nixon is our president and he's wrong in Vietnam, and Paul VI is our Pope and he's wrong on sex. So I thought it was nice. I got everyone thoroughly annoyed at me. And the Cardinal Archbishop of Chicago said to my religious superiors, show cause within 1 week why Crossan isn't kicked out of the diocese.
Wow.
And so I took one look at that and said, okay, I think I see the writing on the wall and I know how to read it. I've read Daniel and I'm out of here. So I went then to become a professor at DePaul University, which is a Roman Catholic, the largest Roman Catholic university.
In Chicago, you mean? Or?
In Chicago, and I loved it. I was there absolutely happy my whole time.
I've actually physically been there. I've been to the bookshop there. A friend of mine, Bill Paletic, who's a Catholic priest from LA originally, he was there as well. And it's a beautiful campus. It's in a great part of downtown Chicago. And yeah, I love it. And you were there all those years. Amazing.
I was 26 and I never wanted to go anywhere else. I loved it.
Of course.
They have strong nerves. The president had very strong nerves. So basically then what happened was, I was in the university, as you said, university setting. And Bob Funk, a colleague of mine who was at the University of Montana, he had said to me, I think it's not right that we as professors of Bible can say anything we want as long as it's written in language that no normal human being could possibly understand, with footnotes, larger than the text, and we do it in our own conventions, and we don't come out into the streets and scare the horses, okay? He said, I don't think that's right. I think if we can have a discussion, did Jesus, for example, actually teach the Our Father as 'tis in Matthew? And nobody in scholarship gets excited if you say, no way. Deity should know about that. So let's go public. Now that was our intention. Our intention was to look for publicity. And a lot of scholars.
What you're doing, you're coming out of the ivory tower. You're trying to open up the ivory tower to some air, a very Vatican II ethos in a way, to let the world in to see what's going on. But you did it with great, you did it with publicity. You used the media, didn't you? You had the people who were part of your organization wasn't there a cinematographer or filmmaker or other? So obviously you wanted to use their skills to promote.
Yes, a lot of our colleagues said, you're looking for publicity. We said, yeah, of course. We want publicity, but we're never going beyond what is the tolerable, but we're all scholars. So if we're saying something here, it may sound radical to a layperson who doesn't know what's been going on, but if we put it into one of our journals, footnoted appropriately, and therefore illegible, there'd be no problem. So it was a matter really of ethics. And that's the most important thing. I really agreed with Bob when he said to me, do you want to be co-chair? And I said, well, does that mean I have to do any work? And he said, no, we want your name. And because I'd been working on the historical Jesus since my first book was 73 in Parables, the challenge of the historical Jesus. So I'd been working towards a big book on Jesus for 20 years or whatever. So the major thing I think that was important is that we tried to tell people both our opinion and our certainty about it. So if we had 40 people discussing a certain, say they wanted to know, did Jesus really say, blessed are the poor? So everyone would prepare papers and we wouldn't come and read to one another, we'd come and discuss. And then at the end, you had to vote.
Now you had to, we say the vote. One of the very distinctive features of this voting process was the use of these coloured beads, black and red. And you did briefly say, I think red is authentic, isn't it? Like authentic, that you have the red words in the Bible traditionally.
So red.
sorry.
Matthew, sure, we're as sure as you can get about anything historical. Now, we weren't infallible. We simply said, in our historical judgment, Jesus said this. Pink would be, well, not so sure. Yeah. Gray would be very unsecure, and black is, in our opinion, yes, this was created by Matthew. Black did not mean rubbish. It meant created by Matthew. Yeah. And of course, the whole point of using beads was for the camera. We could equally have done it on ballots, except that would be boring. So actually what we were doing, and this is the irony, scholars who work on the Greek text of the New Testament, from which everything else is based, usually a committee, let's say of 7 people, at the end you have to vote because you have different opinions.
Yes.
The purpose of voting is not to let on that we're infallible, but if we got, say, 40 people who voted red, that tells you we're pretty sure about it. Yeah. If you got 21 people red and 19 or something black, that tells you guys are on your own. We're really totally divided. Good. So it was the same thing in a way that, of course, done with the King James Bible. You have to bring people together. They have to debate. And at the end, you have to vote. Otherwise, you just talk forever. So anyway, the Jesus Seminar was a shock therapy for many of our colleagues, yes, who were just as radical as we were on their opinions, but they kept it,
yes,
the lock and key, as it were.
But presumably they didn't want to frighten their congregations or threaten their jobs, or they didn't want to cause scandal, or they didn't want to upset people's faith, or many perhaps different motives that led them to just keep it in-house and not share that information.
Many of them were decent motives, but they were the same motives that says, it's not time to end slavery. We have to go gradually. We have to go slowly. They're the arguments that you hear whenever something big is changing, and they're understandable. But we had decided to do it. So at the end of about 20 years, we had pretty much done what we wanted, to be honest with you. Right. And on the 25th anniversary of the Jesus Seminar, all sorts of people said, well, you're dead now. I said, no, we've finished what we wanted to do. We set out to go through the sayings of Jesus and the deeds of Jesus. And now we can do something else. If you want to talk about Paul, for example, or you want to talk about early Christianity. So there's lots of other seminars going on under the umbrella of the Westar Institute, which is the mothership, as it were.
Yes.
The Jesus Seminar was simply the flagship and the first and the most important in a way.
So in your estimation, it was a success. It achieved its objectives. It made public and media exposed to the media, the processes and the thinking that went into assessing the reliability or inauthenticity of saying.
Yes, I think it was an absolute success, Paul. And if I could use a personal example, I had spent most of the 20 years before that writing for my peers. In other words, writing articles and books that no normal human being would ever dream of reading. What I found all of a sudden is I'm getting invited to churches, not just universities or something, but to speak to churches over a full weekend, and very often to preach. Now I'm an ex-priest, but to preach. I wasn't being invited to Catholic churches, to be fair, but I was invited to come in and talk about this.
Yes.
So I spent maybe the last 25 years, like almost a second vocation, as much as I could do, sometimes up to 25 weekends a year or more, speaking in churches. And I'm emphasizing churches. In other words, people were ready for this.
Yes.
And across almost any church you can imagine, except, as I said, not
at the Catholic Church, of course. You remind me in some ways that you were a trailblazer for someone like Bart Ehrman, Professor Bart Ehrman today, who is also, well, he's more of an iconoclast perhaps than you were, but nevertheless, he does make public these scholarly discussions. And he is also, I've seen, invited by many churches as well. There are plenty of YouTube videos of him in churches being held up as someone to learn from and to receive knowledge. And he is now an atheist, well, agnostic atheist.
I think the main difference between Bart and I is that my first degree was a Doctor of Theology. Right. Because the Roman Catholic tradition was, before we let you near the Bible, I got it in Europe, so I'm a Doctor of Divinity, because they like the Latin roots over the Greek roots. But before I got to specialize in Bible or archaeology, I had to get my doctorate in theology. That meant when I'm reading these texts, I'm absolutely conscious of the theological implications.
Yes, right.
It's not, I can not mention them. If I'm talking to a group of people, they're not, I'll talk history. Yes. But I know exactly, because these texts were theological texts.
Yes.
Nobody was writing the gospel just to tell you a piece of history. They really weren't.
No.
In one sense, to let on, they're just pure history is not right. I mean, you have to say these people were interpreting history for you. Now, I can tell you what the history was. I can tell you what the interpretation, but then you have to decide whether you think the interpretation is right or wrong. So I had no problem working history and theology. I really didn't.
No. Well, would you say, I mean, I've not looked at the detailed findings of the Jesus Seminar, but at a guess, would it be true to say that in terms of the read passages, the authentic ones, there's a greater preponderance of those in the earliest tradition, for example, Mark and Q, and would it be the case also in John, the Gospel of John, that we're seeing large tracts of black, if you like, across, you know, the discourses in John 14, 15, 16 and other passages? Yes. Is that...
Absolutely. And I mean, here was the thing that was difficult for me. Maybe it's my Catholic background, but I have an intense sense of metaphor and symbol. So when I'm confronted with something like Jesus walks on the water, my colleague Bob Funk would say, that never happened. Of course it didn't happen. I'm quite certain it didn't happen. What I want to know is why somebody made up this parable. And so I'm going to read it and say, well, wait a minute. The apostles take off rowing without Jesus. Okay. They're getting nowhere. They're rowing like mad without any progress. So motion without progress. Jesus comes out having a trip on the waters. He's not coming out to help them. He's just coming out for a morning jog.
As you do.
They have to get him into the boat. Now, as soon as he gets into the boat, they get where they're going. So I read that and it screams at me. Parable, dummy. I'm a parable. It doesn't simply say Jesus walked on the waters. I wouldn't know what that meant. It tells us, keep him in the boat. And it fascinates me that in Mark, around the year 70, they're already known that the guys are out there rowing like mad without Jesus in the boat. I thought we only discovered that in the Second Vatican Council. So I would have great difficulty with that. I would say, of course it didn't happen, but it's like the parables of Jesus didn't happen either. But I think he's absolutely right about what the Samaritan did, though I don't think it ever happened. So I want to talk also about parable and metaphor, and not just about the literal. I will never fudge it and say, oh, it really happened. He really went out, for a stroll. So there was a little tension always between Bob and myself. He had a great appreciation for the metaphor of Jesus, the parables, but none at all for the parables of the evangelists.
Right.
That they were making up parables just like Jesus.
But is your certainty that the story of Jesus walking in the water, which of course is interesting if you see how Matthew adds to that, he adds to the disciples' reaction in Mark is one of disbelief. They just don't understand. They don't get it. In Matthew's version of exactly the same incident, they end up worship. It says they worship Jesus. It turns out to be a triumph. They're now faith-filled disciples. A very different story, redaction of the same story. But is your view on that based on an a priori skepticism or disbelief in the miraculous per se, or that the genre of those stories in those Gospels has been misunderstood as actual history, when in fact they were intended to be, as you say, a dramatized metaphor? There's two questions there. Is your own philosophical position skeptical, like a rationalist position, and then are you saying independently of that, as a scholar, that these stories have been misunderstood genre-wise? They in fact were never meant or intended to be miraculous stories as we have traditionally taken them.
Let me take a look at them, to the seriatim, as it were. My problem with miracles is this: take them all literally or take them all metaphorically. For example, before Jesus ever existed, as you well know, Caesar Augustus was Son of God, Divine, Lord, Savior of the world. All of these were his titles. And at the end, he was taken up to heaven among the gods. Now, that's one story. Over here, we have another story about another human being living under Augustus, by the way. And we find out he's Lord, Son of God, divine Savior of the world, and he's taken up to heaven with God. Now, the honest thing for you as a historian is to say, okay, I take both of those as fact. And if you take both of them as fact, then you're going to understand why Jesus is going to get himself killed. Because there's only one guy going up there. The Romans are and say, well, we don't really care how many go up. No. Or if you take both of them metaphorical. Now, I take both of them metaphorically, consistently. And if I hear Jewish healings the same, I take them metaphorically.
Yeah.
But I recognize, and this is crucial for me, this is maybe crucial where I disagreed with Bob very often. The crucial point isn't that however you take them, they're in opposition to one another. And what you're saying about Jesus, the peasant from the Nazareth Ridge in Galilee, is high treason against Caesar from the Palatine Hill in Rome. That's why these guys are going to end up dead. Romans weren't brutes.
You can't have two lords running the Roman Empire. It's Caesar or it's Jesus, and you're a traitor if you're a Christian.
You can't have two saviors in the world. And when C.S. Lewis said, well, Jesus, let me say, when Jesus claimed to be God, he was either nuts or he was right. I said, wait a minute, no. There was two people in the first century, and he has a classical education, so Lewis should have known better.
Yes, he would have.
Yeah, there's two people in the first century claiming to be God, so you have to make your choice. And if you take it literally, fine. Take it literally if you will, but don't cheat and say, well, it's a metaphor about Caesar, or a lie if you prefer, or a mistake, but about our guy, it's the truth. So I'm asking for what I might call divine consistency, if you will, not physical rules, but don't cheat. Because
but you as a maybe I'm trying to separate this out, but you as Dominic, are you someone who a priori, perhaps in a Kantian fashion, would rule out the miraculous, God intervening in human affairs as such, regardless of the historical particularities of the first century? Did you rule that out per se anyway?
Not per se. I see no evidence, let me put it that way. I see no historical evidence that any divine being, however construed, God, gods, interferes. To begin with, I do see one supreme being regulated the universe. We call it evolution. It is a supreme being because it is a being. It's there. It bees. And it is supreme. That means that you or I don't control it. We can cooperate with it. So I do not find any evidence, despite the claims in all sorts of religions and all sorts of people, that something divine or out of the order has.
I see. You said in an interview, it was quite a stunning thing when you were a priest and you went to Lourdes in southwest France.
Yes.
And you said that 40 or so sick people went to Lourdes from your gathering, from your group, and there were wonderful stories of healing and that were in the air. And at the end of the day, 40 people came back who were just in the same condition as they were before, but they weren't demoralized. They hadn't lost their faith. And I thought that was an extraordinary story. And I don't really want to go into that, but it does say something that people believe in spite of the failure of anything to happen, and they continue to have that faith regardless.
What I wanted to insist about that in my own experience, and also because Ireland, sends there's a band for airlingers between Dublin and Lourdes. It's running all the time. Yeah. I had often wondered that when people came back from even growing up, why don't they're being told if your faith is strong enough, you will be healed. Now they're told that. They come back not healed. So then I began to think, maybe there's a difference, and of course this is also cultural anthropology, between healing and curing. That something has happened there,
right?
Which I will call we could call it therapeutic. Therapeuan is a verb, as you know, for to heal. No, they're not cured. If the person is lame,
no,
they come back on the stretcher they went. I've seen it. But why isn't that person now doubly crushed? Because A, they're not cured, and B, the faith is inadequate. They should come home totally demoralized. Why do they come home feeling better? And I've seen it. So when I look then at exactly what happened in places like Epidaurus, in the great healing shrines, at Lourdes and in Jesus, they all started to come together.
Yes.
You don't get a story in the gospel. You get the deaf, the blind, the mute, the lame, pregnancy problems. All of that is exactly what you got with at Epidaurus, say, and at Lourdes and with Jesus. Now, if of course you have a great healer, then you're going to hear the story that this healer raises the dead, because that's the job profile of a great healer. Right. If you don't hear that, then you know the person is just an ordinary healer. Mm-hmm. So I don't find any evidence that anyone has ever raised the dead. Mm-hmm. I find claims, of course, in Greek mythology and in Jesus. I wouldn't be surprised. I don't know, honestly, if there's ever been one such at Lourdes, but it wouldn't surprise me.
No.
It wouldn't surprise me if I'd heard of it. So the more important thing for me has this idea of a randomly intrusive divine force. Let me keep it vague for a moment. What it fails to see is Emily Dickinson's marvelous line. Let me see if I can get it. Revelation 'tis not that awaits, but our unfurnished eyes. We don't see it's all around us because we're waiting for the miracle. And we cannot see that it's all a miracle.
Yeah, yeah.
And that healing is one of the possibilities built into the universe. And it comes mostly, by the way, from community. Yes. I'm not sure if everyone went on their own little trip to Lourdes, on their own little stretcher, in their own little jet, that it would have the same effect. No, it's the community of healing. So that was more important for me than, but to be very honest with you, let me put it again. I see no evidence, no convincing evidence of intrusion by any divine force into our world. And I'm afraid that emphasizing it makes us blind to what is there already. So that's why we want to understand.
To your point, just to sort of connected with that, although changing the subject completely, in your new book, you talk about the you're on this grand tour of the Middle East. You go to these amazing countries in Syria and Egypt and Turkey, and you say Russia at one point. I think, bloody hell, how did you get around these vast areas? But you one thing that really struck you, and it struck me because I didn't realize this was the case, that you as a Western European or Latin Catholic person had seen Jesus portrayed repeatedly in the liturgy and art and churches as a solitary figure rising from the dead, escaping. You said like a buff athlete. So there's an extraordinary description. This Superman coming triumphant out of the grave, and our galleries in London here are full of pictures, medieval pictures, just like that. But your experience of Eastern Christianity is very different. That Christ comes with people. He comes with maybe Adam and Eve, or with a company of people, humanity even, out of the tomb. The resurrection isn't a solitary historical event, but a community-wide, humanity-wide. But that was interesting as a kind of a cultural facet. But then you linked it to Matthew 27, and this extraordinary, I call it very rudely, the zombie apocalypse.
Yeah, exactly.
It's where it says here, this is Matthew 27, and this is at the moment that Jesus dies on the cross in the gospel, and the earth shook and the rocks were split. The tombs also were opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. This is the moment of Jesus' death. After his resurrection, they came out of the tombs and entered the holy city and appeared to many. Now, you had noticed something here that I hadn't picked up on before. This is why you're a scholar and I'm not. But you said the tombs. This is the moment of Jesus' death. The tombs were opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. And then you have on the third day after his resurrection, they came out of their tombs. So hang on. What happened? was there a double resurrection, or they came out and then they went back in again and then they came out again? But apart from that, the point here is you're making, I guess, and this connects with your experience in the eastern part of Christendom, is that Jesus' death and resurrection was much more than a solitary event, that it included other people who were asleep, in other words, dead. And then you connect it with Paul's teaching in 1 Corinthians 15, where he talks about Jesus' death being, Jesus' resurrection as the first fruits, meaning perhaps, the initial first resurrection of many other resurrections.
Yeah.
And it occurred to me that this argument was very dangerous. And I'll explain why. Because Paul also had a clear, I think, my view, had a clear expectation of an imminent parousia. There are passages in Paul where the return of Christ on the clouds of heaven, or however it may be configured, was something that was expected soon.
Yeah,
if not very new, very soon. So in Paul's mind, you had, okay, Jesus was the first fruits, the first of many, and soon afterwards, in a matter of just a few years, really, historically, the second stage of all the other resurrections would happen.
Yeah.
But of course, we are living thousands of years later, 2,000 years later. So your argument is actually very dangerous, because what you've done, although it's technically accurate, is to debunk Christianity. To put it very crudely, because if his death wasn't the first fruits, it can't be the first fruits if there's thousands of years of history to come.
Right. Let me clear what happened. That was total surprise. As I said to you, what we're doing from about the year 2000 on, the Borgs and the Crossans were taking 40 people around Turkey in footsteps of Paul. We were assisting Paul.
Right. We
began to see these, you go into, say, a cave church in Cappadocia, you see all these scenes that everyone would recognize: Jesus, Cana, the baptism of Jesus, the birth of Jesus, crucifixion of Jesus, and right next to it, we expect him to come out of the tomb. Yeah. You have him there with Adam and Eve.
Yes.
And if there's only two, they're Adam and Eve. Certainly not the two I would think of coming out with Jesus. Right. I would think of David or Isaiah or Abraham or, somebody, John the Baptist maybe. Yeah. I wouldn't be thinking of Adam and Eve, because Adam and Eve represent humanity in the Bible.
Exactly.
So the reason we had to go to all of these places is because we didn't know what we were doing.
Right.
At the end, when we were ready to write the book, we could have gone on a 6-week tour and seen everything.
Yeah.
As it was, it took us about 20 years. As long as we were going over there with the pilgrims and being paid to go there, we went for a week before and a week afterwards and all over. And it took us a while to realize, first, the most important event in the life of Jesus, the resurrection itself, is never described in the New Testament. Lots of empty tomb scenes, lots of apparitions of Jesus all over the place. You say, wait a minute, those are effects, those are consequences, those are results. Tell me what it was like. What did the soldiers actually see, since they lied and said they were asleep and stole the body? So what did they actually see if they told the truth? Now, another way of putting it, what would Paul have drawn if the Corinthians said, we know what a crucifixion is, we've seen them. Tell us what a resurrection looks like. That was the question I started with. Now, to go back to your point, let me use an example. If Dr. Fauci over here, say in March of 2020, had said, if everyone wears a mask and keeps distance and washes their hands, this will all be over in 3 months. If everyone had done that, it would not have been over in 3 months, but we wouldn't have 500,000 dead. He was wrong on the time. He would have been wrong on the time. He would not have been wrong in the remedy. Maybe Jesus said it too. I don't know. It's argued about Jesus. It depends on whether he said, but Paul certainly, and Mark certainly, and Q certainly seem to think this is a short period of time, because they've just been told something which is staggeringly new. In Judaism and in the Greco-Roman tradition, it was culturally acceptable that your hero, be he a Moses or a Romulus, would be taken up among the gods or to God. That was possible. Individual, somebody who'd been a great general. So resurrection, however, wasn't for individuals. There is no Jewish tradition whatsoever. This is supposed to happen at the end of time. The whole human race is going to be raised up and they're all going to be judged. Then they're going off to heaven or off to hell. Now, that's fine. We can think, I don't believe a word of that. Let me hold you for a second. if you start using about Jesus, the word resurrection, then you're telling every Jew who's listening that this grand scenario has already started. There's no way they could understand it.
Exactly.
Ascension, no problem with ascension. You believe or don't believe, but it's culture. Now, if it's right that it has started, what Paul is telling his people is the resurrection has started. You guys are supposed to be living resurrected lives. The poor Corinthians must say, we're just trying to, get through the day. So that's why he's having so much difficulty with them. But if the resurrection has begun, and that's his metaphor, the first fruits of harvest do not happen 10 years before, or they happen as a continuum. That means Paul has just told you, whether you like it or not, the general resurrection has begun. The last judgment has begun. Heaven and hell has begun. And at that point, I'm going to say, oh my God, he was right. Because I think it's the other way around. It's not there's a great human judgment of all of us and we go to heaven or hell. It's that we're running heaven and hell right here and now in our world. And there's a great human judgment. I'm not talking about God. I'm talking about human evolution. At some day in the future, when the last human being maybe puts out the last light and we find out we've made the planet uninhabitable. And there will be a judgment, because that means that every human being that's ever lived in our own little way that we maybe know nothing about it has contributed one way or another to a heavenly end or a hellish end for our planet and our world. So I want to feed evolution into that before I dismiss that and say, well, I don't believe a word in that. Fine. Because once you announce, be it parabolically, mythologically, theologically, or anyway, that the general resurrection has begun, there's no tradition that says everything else hasn't begun too. So that's what I would say. What does it debunk? It debunks for me the idea that the Titanic has enough lifeboats, so don't worry about it. If we destroy the Earth, we can always go somewhere else. There's always Mars or somewhere. Or God will come and take us away. That's a dangerous delusion for me. I think that's debunk. I want to debunk that because I think it's dangerous.
I think you're perhaps in the Rudolf Boltman tradition of demythologizing and reinterpreting, restating it in contemporary.
Wait, let me say no, please not, because he changed it into individual existentialism. I'm changing it to political existentialism.
No, this is a valid point. No, you're right. In that sense, you're right.
20th century, he really did. He should have said that this radical Jesus is radical, not in my own isolated self. He's radical politically. Yeah. I would say he's radical evolutionary, but anyway.
Indeed, I get that. But in terms of the traditional Jewish categories, staying with those for a second, in Paul's own worldview, that his expectation obviously didn't come about, that there wasn't a general resurrection within his own, nearby. So within his own terms of reference, then, not the way you've reinterpreted it, I get that, but in his own terms of reference, would he not have seen, if he'd been around long enough, the frustration and in a sense, trying to find a suitable word, but the emptiness of the expectation that he had? He would have been disillusioned, perhaps.
I would hope. He's a good Jewish theologian. I would remember that Judaism in the first century was able to have the catastrophic destruction of their temple, which everything else was based, including their home. And all of a sudden, they managed to shift magnificently to say that Torah was the center. And, nobody said about
No, so he could have perhaps done what the Jews did, in a sense, from being, as you say, a temple-centered faith to being a Torah-centered.
Of course,
with
the town. He would have to adapt, but they've been doing that brilliantly, because, I really want to insist on that, because they could have, after the destruction of the temple, have made a little thing like in the desert, the temple doesn't require more than an altar. And they made a magnificent shift. Of course, the Romans were also shifting themselves quietly from a republic to a kingdom by whatever name. So I would say that Paul, confronted with the fact that the generation is dying, now you can hold to the word soon until you're dead. It's coming in my lifetime. Oops, I'm dead.
Okay. Too late now to reflect on that, because it was, okay. Yeah.
But somebody has to say, when the whole generation is gone, okay, can we rethink? We have got the ending wrong. And the logic of it is that the ending has already begun. Now you got two problems. You can debunk the whole thing and say that this whole idea was rubbish. And I think what happened, to explain why Christianity is still around, that large amount of rubbish in it, that there was enough there that made sense of it. It had to, because otherwise, I think most people would have said, as they said maybe about John the Baptist, well, it was a nice idea and maybe got us through a couple of years, but let's quietly bury it now, with all due respect, and say, it's like, horses and carriages, they came to their end, and they were nice, and they're gone.
But is it not also the case that the gospel writers, the later ones themselves, in a sense, wrestled with this and introduced a more realized eschatology, a more present orientated, particularly in John, obviously? So what is eternal life that you believe now that Jesus, you can get that eternal life now? It's not future orientated. It's not something that will happen soon. It's present, it's realized. And
exactly.
Does not the Testament itself actually...
I wouldn't say realized, I'd say realizable. I mean, I would say if you look at John 11, for example, it's an absolute debunk. He ridicules the idea by holding his nose for all practical purposes. Lazarus, if you take this literally, is in the tomb. Yes. He's going to come out someday and he's going to smell a bit, but he's going to be fine. And then, of course, the key statements, Jesus says, I am the resurrection and the life. If you believe in me, you'll never die. And then, wait a minute now, you've changed the meaning of death, because death means you will die. So all of a sudden, John changes it. Yeah. That's why, for me, of course, reading John, though I think it's absolutely unhistorical, is absolutely true. That's where I had so much trouble with my friend Bob, because he would say, that's all bunk. It's not bunk. It's somebody figuring that, people coming out of tombs and all of that isn't the way to go. So what does it mean to say, I am the resurrection and the life here and now? So I would call it, my preferred term is collaborative eschatology or participatory eschatology, because if everyone said, we think this is rubbish, that ends it. You can't have a kingdom of God with only one person in it, Jesus. So again, if the community says, well, it was a good idea, but it didn't work, then it's over. It really is finished.
Well, I think one of the sayings, if you like, of many scholars is that Jesus preached the kingdom of God, and it was the church that came. It was the church that came along. And did that not provide an ongoing established institution that could carry people through that future, with the sacraments, of course, baptism and the Eucharist principally? So that in a sense took over that role of providing that salvation through those sacraments, rather than an apocalyptic. Well, you're not an apocalypticist, are you? And that's if I'm no.
Eschatologist, but not apocalyptic.
Yeah. But nevertheless, I did that function.
But an apocalyptic person, the word is Greek for revelation, means I have a revelation, and if people say, well, what's your revelation? It's going to be about the time. It's next week, it's next month, it's next year. I have a revelation that's all going to be over time X, and time X has been wrong now for 2,000 years. So if you still want to believe in it, good luck to you, but the odds are against you. So something must be happening. Now, whether the church is an adequate vessel,
right?
I mean, I have colleagues who say, well, Jesus against the church. Jesus was carried through the ages by the church. That doesn't mean I'm going to let it away with whatever it wants. I can also think, democracy can be handled by a country, but handled very badly. But maybe be very careful. Let me use a Jesus metaphor. If the wine comes in wineskins, the wineskins ain't important. It's the wine. Don't let them leak if they lose the wine. So it's a precious thing in a not so precious vessel. So I wouldn't want to say we got the church. I think we still have the spirit of Jesus. That's more important than the church.
I wasn't intending to ask you this at all, but it seems a natural question to ask. Do you think that Pope Francis is reintroducing some good wine into the church by his emphasis on pastoral care rather than dogma and theology, which his predecessor was a master at, obviously, Ratzinger. Are you impressed with him as a...
Yes and no. Yes and no. To be honest with you, remember that I was in Rome doing postdoctoral work in the Bible in 59 to 61 under John the 23rd. I watched them do it. I watched them call the Vatican Council. I watched all of that. Yeah. And 5 years later, the Curie had gutted it like a fish by 69. That's when I left in 69. I don't know if Pope Francis can do it either. I don't know if he can do it, because when he talks, for example, about justice and mercy, I get nervous, because that means retributive justice and then you want mercy. The Bible talks about distributive justice. When the Bible is talking about justice, it's a fair share of God's world for everyone. That's what they're talking about. Mm-hmm. Fair share, distributive justice. Yeah. So if you put mercy with it, distributive justice leads to peace. Retributive justice may lead to forgiveness or mercy, but I want to hear more about distributive justice, because that's what the Bible is filled with. That's why Jesus and Paul got themselves put to death by the Romans, because they told the Romans, in fact, you guys talk about justice and you ain't doing it.
This is one thing that struck me about the reaction to Pope Francis, particularly in the United States, from conservative Catholics. They're sort of accusing him of being a Marxist and left-wing. But what he's doing, ironically, is, as far as I'm aware, that he is restating Catholic social doctrine from many generations. He's not inventing this stuff. And maybe it wasn't articulated strongly before. Well, maybe or maybe not. So he's not really being a radical. He's not introducing his own politics. He is stating the Catholic Church's own teaching, which is quite left-leaning in some ways. It's social teaching, I mean. It
is very left-leaning if you're talking about violence. It's not left-leaning if you're talking about sex.
No, true, of course.
That's very important. And so if you talk about justice, then you have to begin at home. I applaud the Roman Catholics' vision of justice outside the church. I would be much more certain if justice began at home, inside the church, with regard to women, for example. I think it is absolutely unbiblical and against Jesus and Paul and everyone else to put women, say they cannot be priests. Paul thinks they can be apostles, so I guess that means they can be bishops, because the bishops are heirs of the apostles. So I have trouble inside the church with justice inside the church, though I do agree with you that they're teaching on violence and social justice.
Yes, social justice as well. It's a surprisingly radical. Perhaps some traditional Catholics in the States hadn't perhaps appreciated just how.
Yes, they didn't know their Bible either.
No, they just thought it's all about, I don't know, abortion and gay marriage or something. Hang on, it's actually the emphasis is on justice. Yeah, indeed. But how do you see, in terms of biblical studies going forward? I don't mean necessarily for you personally, but what do you see are the challenges for biblical scholarship in the future? Are there still sacred cows that need to be slaughtered? Are there still issues that need to be tackled? Or is it the case, which I suspect is the case, that we're going over the same ground over and over again, perhaps at even quicker pace, with ever more contemporary skills drawn from the social sciences or from anthropology, and that we're not really creating new knowledge? We're in a sense being led by secular disciplines, to, whether it be not just feminism, but all the literary genres and this aspect and that. But is there any new challenges that biblical scholarship needs to face, do you think, in the future?
I think, I don't know if it's new or not. I'm trying to think of a line from Jordan Manley Hopkins.
Oh yeah.
Let me, in the 3 lines, let me now jolt, shake, and unseat, I think, your mortist metaphors. That fabulous line, a mortist metaphors. When I'm talking, for example, of the crucifixion, okay, this is my example, I guess. The crucifixion of Jesus. The crucifixion, I think, is a fact, by the way. I know some people might argue, of course, but I think from Tacitus and Josephus, it's a fact as much as anything is ever liable to be a fact.
Yeah.
On the other hand, resurrection is a metaphor. Now, I think crucifixion and resurrection are 2 sides of the same coin. I can't imagine a one-sided coin, and emphasizing either one or the other destroys both of them for me.
So are you saying there's no empty tomb? Sorry, just between, because between the crucifixion in the Christian story and the resurrection, there was a tomb that became empty. Are you saying that that is a later tradition that was retrospectively added in, or
yes?
Right.
I'm saying something more blunt. Mark created it.
Right.
Mark wishes to end his gospel without giving Peter the plaudits of an apparition. He wants no apparitions, possibly because he's writing after the terrible fall of Jerusalem, when, where was Jesus? So he spends a lot of time in 13 telling you it was wrong to imagine that Jesus was going to come back, as
yes,
many Christians must have surely expected. Okay, now finally he's going to come at the last minute.
yes.
And he is telling them no. I'm convinced historically that Mark created the story of the empty tomb in order to avoid earlier stories, which is of multiple apparitions. I am convinced that historically, those closest to Jesus, his closest supporters, after his death, which I consider a fact, had visions of him. I don't find anything supernatural about that. It is absolutely what would be expected in any such a traumatic, sudden death. I would postulate it if I had no evidence of it, because it always happens.
When you say it's always happened, so you have other anthropological or psychological examples, without going into all the details, that are known of, that
yes.
are, in some sense, parallel to this.
Yes, exactly.
Right. Okay.
When a death happens suddenly, dramatically, all of that language, individuals can see and are convinced that as much as, I can reach out and touch you, as it were, as if I could reach out and touch you because I could see your face within my arm's length. I would expect that.
Just interested, there's a wonderful story, a true story. I think J.B. Phillips, the translator of the New Testament at Cambridge University, after C.S. Lewis died, he knew C.S. Lewis. He died the same day J.F. Kennedy was killed, unfortunately. He actually was convinced, and this is an eminent Cambridge Don, he translated Anglican divine. He testified that C.S. Lewis appeared to him in his study at Cambridge or Oxford, I forget which of the two, and spoke to him. Now, this is after he knew C.S. Lewis was dead. He died, but he convinced he was absolutely there in all his 3D glory. And now, in a sense, I'm just offering sort of, obviously a story from England, just to corroborate that.
There are all sorts of stories of that. In other words, I would say vision, like dream, is built-in possibility of our hardwired minds. It's a possibility. Now, how you explain it? I can have a dream and I'm convinced Jesus appears to me and he tells me to go sell everything and go and spend my life with the poor. If I'm convinced of that and do it, then that's reality. I do not think that Jesus is up there hovering somewhere, but I cannot think of anything more real than the lived out experience of a dream or a vision.
Although I agree with you, but I'm just trying to think of a counter example. In the other, you mentioned the destruction of the temple and the Jewish decimation of Judaism, but there was the Bar Kokhba revolt at the beginning of the 2nd century, where a man who was really thought to be the Messiah, I mean, there's some serious rabbinical figures believed in him, and he did win for a time. There was currency issues, and everything was looking rosy until, of course, the Romans came in and crushed him and killed him. But the point of that story is that maybe there were, but I don't know if there were any appearances of this Messiah figure after his death, which is
I don't know that.
Jewish messiahs from that era.
What I am claiming is that metaphor creates human reality. If it is a bad metaphor, you're going to be dead. In the 1930s, let's think of two metaphors. The Third Reich is one metaphor in the 30s in Germany. Over here, it was the New Deal. They're both metaphors. People started to live both of them. One of them worked out and one of them didn't. And I understand that the reason metaphors work out, the reason, for example, why empires all come and go, is because they're not tracking with evolution. if your metaphor doesn't track basically with evolution, you can do whatever you want. It might get you 10 years, 20 years, might even get you 100 years, but it won't track. So I want to take metaphor very seriously, even though I'm completely convinced that the resurrection is not a literal thing. The visions, yes, but they still had then to interpret it. And the obvious interpretation, this is the huge surprise. This is what I once argued with my friend Tom Wright. I would have expected after all those visions, they would have said Jesus, like Moses, like Romulus to the Romans, have ascended to God. He's such a holy person, Son of God, Messiah, anything you want. God has taken him up like Moses, or like Romulus, like Elijah, like Enoch, anyone you want.
Yeah.
An individual, and therefore, of course, we should obey him, therefore. The extraordinary thing is they went from vision to resurrection. Now, I want people to hear that. They could have gone to ascend.
Okay, I get your point. Why then did they not take the obvious cultural option, which is ascension? Why did they go to resurrection and then ascension?
I think they went to the obvious one because the whole teaching of Jesus had been that the kingdom of God is already here if we take it upon us. Now, if you've already been told by Jesus, the kingdom of God is here if we collaborate with it, and you've experienced, because that's the evidence, that when you talk about the kingdom of God and tell people about the kingdom of God, you can heal. Wow, it works. People are being healed. They're telling us they're healed. That's why we're getting crowds. Maybe you don't understand it. Now, Jesus has been killed. Where did the kingdom of God go?
Yeah.
So the only reason I can, and I argued one time with Tom about this, the only way I can get, Tom Wright was arguing that the empty tomb was an actual historical event, as so were the visions. I said, okay, for the moment, let's imagine they are. Let's imagine the tomb was found empty and everything else, with all its ambiguity, obviously. I would still think ascension is the obvious thing they'll jump to.
Yeah.
And I need a reason why they jump to resurrection with all its problems.
Yeah.
And the only way I can see that is, well, Jesus had said it's already started. He didn't say the kingdom of God is coming soon. That was John the Baptist. He said it's already here. By the finger of God cast out demons, then it's already here. Now, it's already here only if everyone doesn't just yawn in his face and walk away. You can't have a kingdom of one. It's a kingdom. It's got some people in it. So he tells them, you take it upon you, you enter into it, these are his metaphors. So if you've experienced that, then his death is going to require some explanation that demands that somehow still here, still going on, not just coming soon. So that's the only historical explanation I can give for it. But it didn't come to that. But that has huge implications. And that's my whole point in the resurrection book, that once you accept with Paul that it's like a harvest, and metaphor, you're caught by your metaphor.
Yeah.
He could have said, well, it's happened to Jesus as a kind of a promise that way off in the future it'll happen to everyone. He could have said a type of promise, a sign. He didn't. He said it at the start.
But he also said, well, according to Luke in Acts, he said, I think in the third telling of the resurrection appearances, that he called it. He said, I forget it was Festus or someone. I was not unfaithful to the vision that I received, presumably the road to Damascus experience, which he calls a vision. And then he says in his letters somewhere that Jesus appeared first to so-and-so, then to James, then to the 200 or 500. And then last of all, he appeared to me as one untimely born. But that he has already characterized that appearance as a vision. So what one can ask then, well, were they all visions if they all were the same kind of resurrection encounter?
Well, I am presuming they are, Paul. I'm presuming that list that Paul has there, and what we get in the penultimate or the last verses of the gospel, but you can already see that vision, it's no longer, he's still with us. It's, I saw him first. No, I saw him first. No, James saw him first. They're already turning the visions into competing hierarchical. And Paul has, Paul point is, okay, I was the last, but that makes me still an apostle.
Yes, yeah.
I had a vision of Jesus, so he's quite willing to be the last.
Yeah, he gets in nonetheless. He's part of the college of apostles. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. So yes, it's crucial for him because he's a little bit diffident and embarrassed by the fact that they knew him during his earthly life,
and he did. Yeah,
I didn't, and that's why he had that dismissive statement. Well, even if we knew him during his earthly life, that's not important.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, it's not important for him.
Important for everyone else.
Important for everyone else. They could say we had a double vision.
True. Yeah. Well, I mean, we've been talking now for over an hour, and I'm conscious that we've covered a lot of ground. I mean, so we might perhaps draw it to a close. But was there anything else you wanted to say about to our listeners of anything at all about this subject?
I think it was the experience when I wrote the historical Jesus, the life of a Mediterranean Jewish peasant.
Yeah,
I know that. By the way, it was written for my peers. I was still not at that, and I was amazed that a $30 book of 500 pages suddenly became a kind of a bestseller, though I was never sure how many people finished it. See, your royalty checks don't say bought book, didn't finish. They say bought book. So, but I noticed a lot of people rejoiced in it because it debunked Christianity, which I find, was very bad theology because it was very bad history. Very bad history. And I had always been working myself, professionally and personally, on the borderline between history and theology, because theology for me is the deep interpretation of history. Otherwise, it's just superstition or fantasy. If it's in, and that's, I'm going to say that to any religion. What are you imagining? If it doesn't have to be the history of the first century, of course. Maybe it's anthropology, but it has to have some grounding. Otherwise, it's fantasy, and fantasy is fun. But as Yeats said years ago, if you've got too much fantasy, you end up with brutality, which is a very, very thing to think about. Too much fantasy, you think we just end up with fun.
That's why I like you, Don. You keep on mentioning these Irish or Anglo-Irish poets. You mentioned Yeats now, and you mentioned Gerald Manley Hopkins, who was a Catholic priest here in London at Farm Street. It's great.
Fabulous poet. Yes. So I would ask people, please take metaphor very seriously, because as far as we can see, it creates human reality. It's a way of seeing as, clouds sail across the sky. Okay, we all get it. They're thinking of them as boats. No problem. Then if metaphors get big enough, we're inside them. And our destiny and our fate as human beings is to live out those metaphors. And if they're bad metaphors, they'll destroy us. If they're good metaphors, then they work.
Are you asking, if I could just unpack this a little bit, are you asking Christians, Muslims, Jews, whoever, who believe in a mind-independent, transcendent reality, whom they call God,
yes,
who is eternal, outside of space and time in some way, in traditional theology anyway, are you saying that they should, in a sense, move on from that and embrace a more metaphorical, symbolic understanding of these realities? Are you asking them to take that paradigm shift? Because it's a fundamental shift. It's not just a question of language. We're moving from an actual belief in something that is independent of our own reasoning that created everything to a more Gerald Manley Hopkins-esque kind of way of looking at it, full of vivid color and metaphor, but nevertheless not having that metaphysical reference point. Do you see what I mean?
I'm asking them as a precautionary preliminary measure. Would you agree with me, just for the moment, to actually leave out discussion of whether there is an independent supreme being out there that you just mentioned, but whether there is or not, that supreme being has created a thing called evolution. And when I mean evolution, I mean the Big Bang, I mean all of that.
Oh, right. I was thinking of Darwin, because Darwin didn't create the laws of, Darwinian evolution didn't create the laws of physics. It didn't create the Bang. So you mean that in a cosmic sense? Okay.
I mean that in a cosmic sense. I really do. And that we are in that whether we like it or not. So if I was absolutely convinced that there was an independent God, like a unmoved first mover, then the first move was evolution. So could we take that seriously for a while and then ask, how that shows us about this supreme being we're talking about. Because Paul said, remember, you should be able to see God through creation.
Romans chapter 1.
And Christ. Now, when I hear creation anytime, I cross it out and put in evolution. I mean all of that. I don't mean I'm saying evolution instead of Genesis 1, which is the most marvelous interpretation of the meaning of evolution that's ever been written in one chapter, made in the image and likeness of God, and start acting it. So I would simply ask, could we just start for a moment and talk about that? Instead of getting into debate, does God exist? Yes or no, can't be sure. And we know that evolution exists. And I have a way of reading every religion, including my own Christianity, by asking, how does this track with evolution? So yeah, I'm asking them because I'm not really, my point is, if we trap one another in arguing, I think God exists, I don't think God exists, I think God's independent, I don't think once again, what are we not asking when we're asking the wrong question? So I'm trying to ask of any religion, tell me where you are on evolution first. If you don't accept it, then we're not living in the same world. And I don't know what's the point in talking about God, because how could we possibly agree on that if we don't even live in the same world from whose history we extrapolate to theology? Otherwise, as I said, it can start with fantasy. I suppose you could do that. You could start just with pure fantasy. But I think that leads to dangerous forms of superstition that there's no way that we can judge them. Mm-hmm. If you have a fantasy of God and God demands that you kill your firstborn son, I don't know how to stop that unless you start with history. And
I think, I respect what you're saying. My own view is very different. I'm more of an idealist in the philosophical sense, of believing that mind is prior to matter. Mind creates matter in a sense. And I think for me, evolution, there's biological evolution, there's macro and micro evolution, but there's also the cosmic development from the Big Bang, the laws of physics, which I don't think necessarily evolved in that same Darwinian sense, that they're still a bit of an uncertainty where they came from and why they're so fine-tuned and why there's this exquisite balancing to the various forces in the universe, which are not evolution in the sense that Darwin understood the term word evolution. For me, so for me, I see the universe itself has many signs or indications of intelligence beyond the universe, whether it be in not just in the laws of physics, but in these extraordinary molecular machinery that we can now see in human cells. You can see them on YouTube, which have an extraordinary engineering complexity about them, which to me, I'm not a scientist, but they suggest that there is some intelligence going on here, rather than a blind, random process of evolution without any teleology. So I'm being a heretic here and suggesting that, because teleology is being banished from science, from Aristotle, but I think there is some foresight, some teleology in nature. But again, I'm not a scientist, so I think the universe itself does suggest an intelligence beyond itself, whom religious people call God, and that's still a going concern. And it's not, for me anyway, not merely a metaphor. It has a metaphysical hardness to it, in the way I see things anyway.
Okay, let me then conclude with this. I'm talking about the Big Bang. I'm talking about the moment when matter, energy, time, and space were simultaneously created. Yeah. Now, if I focus on that, which I do, I see three mysteries. I'm not saying problems, because problems you can solve, or think you can solve eventually. One is why there is anything rather than nothing.
Exactly.
Okay. A second one is why, granted there's anything rather than nothing, why is it dynamic and not just static?
Indeed.
Just better. And thirdly, granted it's dynamic rather than static, why is it so absolutely just? By just, I mean fair. I would never want things to be fair to the virus and to the person it kills. I'd like to squash a few viruses. I'd like justice to be a lot more organized, shall we say. So when I look at those three, and by the way, they are 3 in 1, and I'm not fooling around. They are 3 in 1 because I cannot separate them. That I call, with a capital M, mystery. It's not a person, but it ain't nothing. As soon as the human being, the human mind, if you say, was that there before we were there? Yes, it was, but we didn't know about it. Nobody knew about it, the Big Bang until we began to be able to know it. But once we could know it, we could know that that opening moment, that opening second, and that makes no sense because time wasn't there until it was there. That's a mystery. It's not, I don't think it's something that scientists will eventually figure out or anything else, why there is being rather than nothing.
That basic question of ontology is the ultimate question. And why is there something rather nothing? It's one that Wittgenstein, I think, was.
But see, I want to say that it is that mystery that creates all human creativity. So it's not, I want to say, well, I wonder why it is. I think it's a mystery, but it pervades all of evolution, including us. And I think in fact, all of human creativity comes pretty much out with that same 4 time, space, tradition and vision. So I do not see God as a person. I see God as a mystery. That I would not give up that term. I don't see why I would give it up to people who want to use it to mean something else. They may say I shouldn't use it, and I'm told all the time that I'm an atheist, but that's fine. I'm not believing in their God.
No. That's
what Romans said to the Jews and the Christians quite correctly. You're atheists, meaning that you don't believe in our God. God, of course.
Yeah.
So it makes a huge difference whether, I think, you start with mystery at the core, everything. Because if it does nothing else, it makes you a little bit cautious.
Well, that's a very beautiful way of putting it. And I just want to then thank you very much indeed for your time. And I appreciate you're a busy man and so much going on in the world. And I actually really enjoyed our conversation. And it's been a rich experience for me. So all I can say is on behalf of all our viewers, thank you so much for taking time out to talk to us. John Dominic Crossan.
And it's been a pleasure, Paul. And anytime, I would love to talk to you anytime your viewers would like. All right. Thank you very much. And if you're in England, it's good night.
Good night. Stay well. Keep healthy. Thank you. Bye-bye.